Hi, everybody. I'm Dennis Daly. I spent 20 years with United Press International, most of it with the old UPI Radio Network. And my favorite assignment was going on the road producing and hosting American Montage. It was an hour-long weekly program. Now here's an edited version of one of those shows. When I was growing up, I would spend my Saturday afternoons at the local theater, and part of that was watching the Roy Rogers Writers Club. I never got to meet Roy. I got to wave at Dale once. I had been watching American movie classics one day, and they ran the old Ralph Edwards' This Is Your Life Roy Rogers show. And there on the show at the time, and this was in the early 50s, was his little son Dusty. I thought, well, let me call the Roy Rogers Museum and see if I can do an interview. And the phone answered, Roy Rogers Museum. It was Dusty, all grown up, decades later. He was my guide as we went around the museum in Victorville, California, and I started out by reminiscing, by telling him my own feelings and experience about his mom and dad. Roy Rogers, Dale Evans had a certain aura where you felt you knew them. We were talking before we started the interview, the fact that when I was a kid, if I did not get to go to the Saturday matinee to see the Roy Rogers Writers Club, I cried. I mean, it was like this was a buddy of mine, a family I wanted to go visit. So making it accessible like this is really great for the public.
Well, Dad thought it was important enough. He started back in 1930. They were doing a show in San Bernardino. He and the Sons of the Pioneers. They were doing a show for the Salvation Army, and they on that same show was Will Rogers. And then they got to talking about this airplane and all this stuff. And of course, the next week, Will Rogers was killed in a plane crash in Point Barrow. And so Dad had heard and they turned his place into a museum. So he says, I'm going to go out and see it. So he got on his motorcycle and ran out there, and all they had was a pair of boots and a saddle and and he thought, gee, it'd be nice if I ever make it in this business of show business. He said, I'm going to save everything and someday have a museum. His real name is Leonard Franklin Sly, and thank God he changed it, or I'd have been Leonard Sly Jr., and that would have been a real drag.
So the family grew up in southern Ohio, I believe along the Ohio River, right. In the very extreme southern part of the state. It was hard times. His dad, I think, worked in a shoe factory at one time?
Right, and Dad also worked there when he got old enough to tie on a work apron, and both of them worked for the United States Shoe Company in Cincinnati.
Well, to tell us, if you will, how the family made the transition. Was one family member move west first, and then the rest of the family came out, I know from seeing pictures, almost as if grapes of wrath with everything piled on the old car.
Right. Well, Mary, Dad's older sister, had moved out here. She had married, and they moved to California, and they'd been out here a few years. And Dad was working at the shoe factory, and my grandpa was working at the shoe factory, and they just got tired of sewing shoes together. And well, we used to call him Pop. My grandfather came to Dad and said, hey, son, he said, let's quit our jobs here and let's go out and visit Mary in California. So that's when they made their first trip out here. And of course, it was during the Depression, 1929, 1930, when the bottom fell out of everything, and Dad had saved up about $90 to make the trip, and they came out, and that's what's, and then he went back. Dad hitchhiked back home the next year, and they came back out permanently. Then he moved back out.
Now, this is a picture of Roy and his first wife, Arlene, and Arlene is your mother, right?
Right. Yes, Arlene.
She died very shortly after you were born.
She died about 4 days after I was born from a blood clot. In those days, they didn't get the moms up and walk them around like they do today, and they don't have the medications to thin the blood. So she had a blood clot and it went to her brain and caused her to pass out over the bed, and then before they could even get to her, she was gone. At that time, Dad had 3 children. He had Cheryl, my oldest sister, was adopted because they didn't think my mother could have any kids. And then about 4 or 5 years later, along came my sister Linda, and then I came along about 3 years later. So Dad had instant family there, ready to go. And then, of course, he married Dale a year and a half after, when I was about a year and a half old. So.
But he had met your mother when they were on tour, right? The family baked a pie, had more for supper, isn't that the way that
Right. Dad was, of course, times were tough in those days, and Dad was in Roswell, New Mexico, doing a barnstorming tour down through there, and every time they got a chance to be on a radio station or radio show, they would always get in the fact that, boy, we sure like fried chicken, or boy, we sure like lemon pie, and hopefully that somebody would come and bring them something to eat, and that usually happened. It worked real well, and my mother called in and said, if you'll sing Pioneer Mother of Mine, she says, my mom and I'll bring you lemon pie down, and they did. Right after the show, they had 2 lemon pies, and Dad and the Pioneers inhaled it, and then they became friends, and they started writing each other, and every time Dad would come through Roswell, he'd stop and see her, and then push came to shove, and they ended up getting married.
Well, Dusty, let's move on a little bit here, because this early period we could spend a lot of time on, but you mentioned the Sons of the Pioneers. I guess Tumbling Tumbleweed is the song everybody associates with them, but your dad really then started out getting into show business and touring as just a member of that musical group.
Right, he was a member of several musical groups, but the Pioneers was the one that he started, along with Tim Spencer and Bob Nolan, because Dad sang with the International Cowboys and the Old Bar Old Cowboys and several different groups before he actually formed the Sons of the Pioneers. But that was the first group. It started in 1931, and it's still going today. Sons of the Pioneers are still around. Of course, Dad's the only original one left. All the rest of them have passed on.
Let's move on further into his career. There's a whole section of pictures of Roy growing up and the kids in the beginning. You mentioned the fact that it began to be a complicated family. I've always thought that for a person who wanted to keep a family tree, the Roy Rogers family would require a lot of asterisks to get it all straightened out.
Right. The last, we call it the his and yours and us'ns and ourns family, because we kind of just, I have adopted sisters and brothers. I have foster sisters and brothers, and so it's quite a wad. We had 9 kids at home at one time. We've lost 3. There's 16 grandchildren and 27 great-grandchildren, and I think 1 an oven, so it's quite a wad.
We've gotten into some pictures of Dale Evans here, and I guess until I saw that special on American Movie Classics, I wasn't really aware of the singing career that Dale Evans had, and I guess I thought of her as always being Mrs. Roy Rogers. You know, she was always there, and kind of in that tradition of Jack Benny and Mary Livingston. They were married, but they weren't married, and in some of the movies they were, it got to be a complicated kind of thing. But there's just some gorgeous pictures of her in a whole different career that a lot of people don't know about.
Well, it was early career. Again, she was struggling like Dad was. She started out as a secretary and worked as a secretary for a long time, but her first love was always singing, and she was always clowning around at home, and their mom always said, well, you ought to try to get work in radio. So that's what she did. She started working as a secretary to a guy who owned a radio station, and she got a chance to sing. Kind of went on from there, and she ended up singing in Chicago at the Blackstone Hotel and several others. She sang with Anson Weeks Orchestra.
Well, right here with us is Jim Lounsbury, who was at WHAS. We have some pictures of her then. Did you cross paths with Dale back then?
No, I was there after she was there, Dennis. Okay. I worked there in the mid to late 40s, but I saw a picture of an announcer here who was still there when I was, Foster Brooks.
That's the fellow now who does the drunk routine, right?
Yeah.
And here's the Jeep Nellie Bell.
Yeah, we got Nellie Bell in here. Can't have a Roy Rogers story without Nellie Bell.
And then behind it is the car that the Rogers, the Sly family, moved out west in. And I remember in that old This Is Your Life segment, Ralph Edwards saying that your dad had told him that he really started crying the hardest when he saw the old car brought out.
The old car and his mom, yeah, that would do it. But this is the old Dodge that came in. This is a 1923 Dodge, and it used to be a sedan. They cut the back of it off and made a flatbed out of it so they could haul all their stuff, and they hauled a trailer behind it. And they came out across the old washboard 66, all the way out to California.
Well, Dusty, this has been good fun and a great thrill, but I know you're busy, and I want to thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, sir.
And there you have it, another edited episode of one of the American Montage programs prepared for the UPI Radio Network back in the 1980s and 90s. I'm Dennis Daly. Thanks for listening. Thanks for going with me this week. And check YouTube for more American Montage programs.